We often hear about kids being radicalized by whack jobs like Andrew Tate. I think we now need to talk about adults being radicalized on the internet. Adults like Gary Lineker, who's been radicalized, it seems to me, by the centrist subculture, by that Brexit bashing, Tory bashing, noisy gang on the internet who love to signal their virtue and demean people who disagree with them. It seems to me that he's been radicalized by that.
Hello, welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Damian Riley. Today I'm going to be joined by Chief Politics Writer at Spiked Online, Brendan O'Neill. We're going to be discussing Gary Lineker, who today has stepped down after presenting BBC's Match of the Day for 26 years. This has come after Lineker posted on social media an anti-Israel video that featured a problematic rat emoji. Moments ago, he made a statement announcing his departure.
Last week, I shared a post here on Instagram that contained an emoji that has awful connotations. Unfortunately, I did not see the emoji. If I had, I would never, ever have shared it. The relationship with the BBC has been long and wonderful, but it's the right time for the organisation and myself to go our separate ways.
So, Brendan, are you surprised it's come to this with the BBC and Gary Lineker? And are you also surprised it's taken this long?
Yeah, it seems to have taken ages for them to have taken any kind of action. He's clearly been rubbing them up the wrong way for quite some time. It seems to me that his brain was really melted by Brexit. And after that, he became this kind of god of the centrist dad. They hung on his every word. They loved his tweets about Brexit. They loved his tweets about the Tories. And lately, they've been loving his tweets about Israel and Gaza. I am a free speech fanatic, as some readers of The Spectator might know. But when you work for the BBC, there are certain rules. When you are in the pay of the licence fee payer, when you're in the pay of ordinary people, when you work for the public broadcaster, there are certain rules about how you can present your political views, when you can present them, what you can say. And he seems to have broken those rules on numerous occasions. And I think finally, this repost he did of an Instagram story that seemed to compare Zionists to rats, that was clearly a step too far for the BBC.
Okay, so before we get to the infamous rat, Gary has always been, he's always tried to draw a line between his role as a sports presenter and his political tweets and said these rules shouldn't apply to me because I'm a sports presenter, I'm not a political commentator. And he's also argued that he is a freelancer rather than a full-time BBC staff member. Is there any validity to that argument, or is it a little bit disingenuous, do you think?
I think it's a bit disingenuous because his public clout comes from the fact that he is a sports presenter on the BBC. I mean, he was famous for being a footballer for a very long time, and then he was famous for being a football pundit. So his platform, the reason he is Gary Lineker, the reason his name is known across the UK is because he presents Match of the Day on the BBC. So his public fame, his public influence is directly related to his role at the BBC. And that is very, very important because what it means is that he's a well-paid not member of staff, but he's a well-paid person who works for the BBC. And he presents a primetime show that many, many people watch. And therefore, it does seem reasonable that the BBC said to him, listen, the rules apply to you as well. You can't be online referring to the Home Secretary as having made a Nazi-style speech, which he said about Suella Braverman. You can't be online holding forth on Brexit every minute of the day. Now, I don't particularly think the BBC is very good at neutrality at the moment. Objectivity is not its strong suit, but that is at least what it has to aspire to. So when one of its star presenters is out there putting forward all these opinions, that is a problem for the BBC.
Free speech is obviously the bedrock of The Spectator and of the United Kingdom. Should Gary Lineker not be allowed to say whatever he likes just because that he is a sports presenter on a famous football show on the BBC?
Yeah, he should be free to say anything at all. I'm such a free speech fundamentalist. I even think he should be free to share a post saying that Zionism is rat-like, even though I think that's really grotesque. But the issue is his relationship with the BBC. And that does come with certain rules. It's like, I work at Spiked. I can't go online and have a pop at my editor, Tom Slater. I can't, that's not a freedom I have. It's not something I would want to do either, just to make that clear. But there are certain rules and regulations when you work in certain areas and when you hold certain positions, and it comes with responsibilities. So outside of the BBC, now that it seems he's been let go, and it seems he'll have to do something else, he should be free to say whatever he wants. He should be free to share rat posts, have a pop at the Tories, whatever, fill his boots up. He can say anything. But I just think it's unrealistic to say that if you're a member of staff or a freelancer or in some way employed by the public broadcaster, that you have the same right as everyone else to say whatever you want. I think it's been recognized for a long time that that comes with certain rules, and it seems he broke the rules. So freedom of speech for him now, yes, but when he was at the BBC, he did rule break, and that's going to have consequences.
In terms of the rat, Gary says that he didn't notice it, or his spokesman said he didn't notice it. And he deleted it as soon as he was informed. Do you think that if what he posted hadn't included that rat emoji, that this wouldn't have happened, and he would continue his association with the BBC, and things wouldn't have come to a head?
Yeah, that's a good question. Ratgate, was it the rat that did it for Gary? I expect it was. I expect it was because not only was he reposting a rant about Zionism, which is what it was. I watched it. It's a 2-minute rant about, the problem of Zionism. But he reposted a rant about Zionism that was illustrated with a filthy, twitching rat. I mean, it was a really gross thing to see. I think you're probably right in what you're suggesting, that if he had just posted the ridiculous nonsense about Zionism that was being posted, he would probably still be in his position, because on his Instagram account, particularly in his Instagram stories, he's been posting about Israel Hamas for a long time. He's been posting incredibly harsh, critical commentary about Israel. So the BBC seemed to not have a particular problem with that. The straw that broke the camel's back was the rat, to mix my metaphors. And I think that's probably what done him in the end. His ignorance about the rat, I mean, I think we should give him the benefit of the doubt. He said he wouldn't have clocked that it was an association that was often made between Jews and rats in history. But that ignorance is kind of unforgivable. Most people are aware at some level that in the mid-20th century, in Nazi Europe in particular, Jews were frequently compared to rats. They were compared to vermin. It was one of the most repulsive propaganda tactics of the Nazi regime. He should have some knowledge of that. As a man who poses as anti-racist, as progressive, as super right-on, he should have some awareness that that is what was done to Jews in the mid-20th century. So his ignorance is no excuse. He should have known, he should have been aware, he should not have reposted that story.
Yes, and I suppose the BBC was in an extremely difficult position because it fired Danny Baker on the spot a couple of years back when he posted the infamous chimpanzee picture just ahead of the royal baby being born. Can you remember that?
Yes, I've been thinking making the exact same comparison over the past few days, which is that the BBC took swift action against Danny Baker after he posted a picture of a chimpanzee being walked by the hand, and he said something about the royal baby, Harry and Meghan's baby. I do think it was a misunderstanding in Danny Baker's case, just as I'm willing to give Gary Lineker the benefit of the doubt that he wasn't aware of the rat comparison. But the double standard is extraordinary. And what we have at the moment is the left in particular in this country is coming out to bat for Gary Lineker. They're defending him. They're offering him their solidarity. There is no way they would be defending a public figure who had compared black people to monkeys. There is no way they would be defending a public figure who posted or reposted a caricature of an Indian person or a Pakistani person or some other racist caricature. But when it comes to Jews, when it comes to Zionists, when it comes to that horrendous rat image, they seem to not have a problem. They seem to think that's fine. And it really does bring to bear David Baddiel's point that Jews don't count. When it comes to political correctness, when it comes to these supposed social justice warriors, they're alert to racism absolutely everywhere, even where it doesn't actually exist. But when it comes to Jews, when it comes to anti-Semitism, when it comes to anti-Zionism, which is often just anti-Semitism and a kafir, suddenly they're blind to it. Suddenly they don't mind it. Suddenly they're defending the people who do it. So that shocking hypocrisy, I think, is very, very telling.
Yeah, so I'm interested in that. I read your brilliant piece in Spiked, in which you talked about turbo smug liberals and the liberal class, and I think a lot of them A lot of people accuse the BBC of holding incredibly liberal views that are prevalent within its workforce. And I was just wondering why, in your view, why it's okay to smear or to be rude about Jews and Israel, and to tolerate it where you wouldn't possibly tolerate it against other sections of society or against other races.
Yeah, that's the big question of our time because it is so noticeable. We live in an era in which everything is considered racism. A young school kid scuffing a page of the Quran is discussed as Islamophobia. If you ask a black person, where are you from? Or how do you do your hair? Apparently, these are racist microaggressions. We're constantly told that everything is racism. And yet when it comes to anti-Semitism, which has returned with a vengeance, there has been a huge spike in anti-Semitic assaults and abuse in Europe over the past 18 months. When it comes to that, the so-called anti-racist left, the so-called anti-fascists just look the other way, or they make excuses for it, or often they're actually involved in it. If you look at these protests that we've had against Israel every weekend, pretty much since 7th of October, we've seen people waving placards comparing Jews to Nazis, saying that they killed Christ and now they're killing Palestinians, saying that they control the BBC, they control the media, they controlled world politics. All those old, ugly, anti-Semitic stereotypes have been rehabilitated at the altar of Israelophobia. And the left that poses as anti-racist, that poses as anti-fascist, is either involved in that or blind to it. I think it's an extraordinary double standard, and I think it really springs from the politics of identity. Because when you assume that all brown people are oppressed, all white people are privileged, and you see Jews as white, in fact, you see them as hyper white, that's often what they say about Jewish people, then you just see them as this problematic, privileged group in society who must atone for their privilege, who must beg forgiveness for the special position they hold in society. That is the presumption now made by the identitarian left. So the great twisted, dark irony to this so-called identity politics is that it's ended up rehabilitating one of the oldest forms of racism, which is anti-Semitism.
Yes, that's an interesting point. And it seems bizarre that a couple of years ago, Gary Lineker himself was claiming that he'd been on the receiving end of racism as a child and as a pupil at school because he had slightly black skin or dark skin. Do you think there's a predictability to Gary Lineker's views? They're all sort of achingly sixth form, liberal, smug, that he never surprises with any of the views he holds.
No, he's got every conformist, centrist opinion you can imagine. Every milquetoast opinion of the dullard classes comes out of Gary Lineker's mouth. All of them. Brexit stinks. The Tories are bad. Israel is evil. Everything you'll hear at every Daunt Books soiree, he comes out of his mouth. I mean, it's so unbelievably predictable. And, I think the issue with Gary Lineker is, for years and years, he was football's Mr. Nice Guy. He was seen as, in some ways, the Steve Davis of football, a bit dull, but a good egg. That's basically how people saw him. He famously never got a red card, I think, on the football pitch. He was always seen as a good guy. So what's happened to him over the past few years is quite extraordinary. And I actually think it's a good example of radicalization on the internet. We often hear about kids being radicalized by whack jobs like Andrew Tate. I think we now need to talk about adults being radicalized on the internet. Adults like Gary Lineker, who's been radicalized, it seems to me, by the centrist subculture, by that Brexit bashing, Tory bashing, noisy gang on the internet who love to signal their virtue and demean people who disagree with them. It seems to me that he's been radicalized by that. So he's gone in a relatively short period of time from being everyone's favorite football commentator to being a man who seems to have been let go by the BBC for posting an image of a rat next to a discussion of Zionism. That is one hell of a tumble for someone to take. And I think it is indicative of what the internet can do. And it seems to me this is Gary Lineker's brain in the post-Brexit moment has really turned to mush. And there's an element of tragedy there, even if some of us think it's about time the BBC did something about him.
Yeah, I mean, one issue he famously kept quite quiet on was the trans athletes competing. So athletes born as men competing against women. I think quite a lot of the lobby against that were frustrated by his silence on it, particularly in football. Where does the BBC go now? Do you think they were scared of him previously? The first time they tried to get rid of him, that the his co-presenters on Match of the Day threatened to walk out, or they downed tools, and the BBC ended up backing down. Why do you think they're no longer scared of him and prepared to take action? And how difficult will it be to find a replacement?
Yeah, I think this showdown has been a long time coming. And I think Gary Lineker really pushed the BBC too far. That's what happened. And he thought he was bigger than the BBC. He thought he was more important than their rules. And he was an egotist, essentially. That's what it seems. He mistook his social media clout, his social media celebrity for moral authority. And he wielded that moral authority in ways that I think were entirely inappropriate. And it just became too much for the BBC, even though, you know, the irony, of course, is that most of the bigwigs at the BBC probably agree with all his silly views and probably did not want to get rid of him. But I just think he pushed them that bit too far. You know, I actually think this is a bit of a loss for the BBC. You know, Gary Lineker was good at his job. And even now, when you switch on Match of the Day, he still says good, interesting things about football. He knows his stuff. He's a good presenter. He has a personality on the TV. So it's a loss for the BBC. And I'm not sure that Match of the Day will be the same, although, of course, people will still watch it. People watch it for the football, not for the personalities. But it is a loss for the BBC. And I think it demonstrates a real straining of the relationship between the BBC and Gary Lineker, which I think is entirely Gary Lineker's fault. And anyone else in his position, an influential sports commentator, a well-paid sports commentator, a well-loved sports commentator, would have just left the politics for the private sphere and not felt that need to hold forth on every issue under the sun on Twitter and Instagram every day of the week. So he played his cards wrong, and he's suffering the consequences. And it's a sad day for him, but I think it's probably a good day for the BBC because it does now reaffirm those rules that if you're in the pay of the public broadcaster, there are certain things you can say and there are certain things you can't say.
Do you think he should be allowed, given what's happened, to present the final Match of the Day next weekend?
Yes, probably. I think, you know, even though this is a collapse of an old standing relationship and it seems to be quite acrimonious and it is Gary Lineker's fault, I think probably give him one more go, let him do that final show. Who knows what he'll do? He might make some grand statement or pronouncement to the nation, which would be disastrous. But yes, I think let him do it one more time. That can be his send off. And then that's the end of it for him. He's made his bed and he needs to lie in it.
And what next for him? Do you think this will affect him post BBC? Will other corporations or broadcasters throughout the world be reluctant to work with somebody that holds his views? Or do you think he'll just go on to greater things and make a fortune through his podcasts and presenting for international broadcasters?
Yeah, well, he's got his podcast empire, so I don't think he'll be short of a few bob. Those surreally successful podcasts that he produces, you know, the rest is politics and all the rest of it. So he'll be doing well with that. I think actually there will be other broadcasters who will snap him up. You know, we know that sadly the broadcast world, a lot of it anyway, is beholden to precisely the kind of views that Gary Lineker loves to spout. They're Brexit phobic. They think the Tories are really evil. They think Nigel Farage is even worse. They're very iffy about Israel. All those opinions that you hear at every dinner party in the land, they are pretty powerful in most broadcast companies. And I wouldn't be surprised to see one of them snap up Gary Lineker and to give him free rein to present stuff and also to do political stuff outside of his presenting. So I think he'll be fine. I think he'll probably just do his podcast stuff for the next few months, but I wouldn't be surprised to see him pop up on some big network sometime soon.
So we haven't heard the last of Gary. All right. Well, thank you very much, Brendan, for joining us. I appreciate it a lot.
Thank you.